Monster Professor.
Welcome to the Monster Professor, a show in which we discuss and explore monsters in literature, myth, film, games, folklore, culture, and beyond. I'm your host, Josh Woods, author, editor, professor, and monster expert. And I hope you enjoyed the October takeover on the Monster Professor with a lot more podcasts than I normally put out in a single month. I'm going to go back to about one every 2 weeks or so, and we've got some cool episodes coming up. And today's episode, I'm going to go back to a solo episode in which I zoom in on one particular kind of monster. This one has been requested a few times now, and I've been avoiding it because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to say. I'm still not sure what I want to say. I just know the kinds of examples that I want to dig into, and I'm wondering if maybe by exploring them out loud, I can come up with some point about it, some point about this thing. I don't know, we'll see. So maybe I'll just talk with myself, which is apropos to today's monster. I want to talk about doppelgangers. So first, maybe I should address that wonder, if you have it. Why does the monster have to mean anything? Why can't we just talk about monsters without things meaning things? Well, we can, and we have on this show. But now that I'm well past a year into the show and dozens of episodes, I realize that I have been kind of getting closer and closer to what a monster is, and people keep asking me, and I keep having to try out answers, as in like putting some sort of sword back into the forge, bringing it out and hammering it again. And I've realized that one of my working definitions involves the fact that it has to have meaning, like this monster being this aberrant or extra mundane entity, like a strange being. And a strange being that what? What about this strange being? Well, it has to be dangerous or threatening in some way. It has to be an embodiment of the unknown in some way, or embody a mystery in some way. But there's a third element that I think it has to have, and it has to have portent. It has to have meaning. I like portent a little bit better because it suggests darker things than just meaning, which might suggest perhaps happier things. But I think a good monster, one worthy of talking about, the deeper you dig into it, the more you come up with something that's more than just the monster itself. So with all that said, what about the doppelganger? I don't have any idea what it means, but maybe we'll figure one out. So let's just start running through some examples of the doppelganger. No, wait, we can't do examples. We gotta clarify, what the heck is a doppelganger? Okay, so a doppelganger it's this German word, quite obviously a German word, or it could be Dutch. There's some disagreement about the origin of the thing, but it's a Germanic word for sure. And it's for this entity that is a double. Doppelganger is like literally something like double goer, like goer as in walker. So something that's going around being a double of something else. The Irish concept for it was called a fetch. And it first showed up in the English language. The doppelganger first showed up in the late 1820s, early 1830s. With Sir Walter Scott. He wrote about it in his letters on demonology and witchcraft, and he talks about it here I have the quotation here where it first shows up in English. He says, a common instance is that of a now he's talking about encountering these strange and terrifying creatures in the wilderness, and referring back to a poem that he was citing. He says, a common instance of that is that of a person haunted with a resemblance whose face he cannot see. If he turn his cloak or plaid, he will obtain the full sight which he desires, and may probably find it to be his own fetch, or wraith, or doppelganger. And that's their first real instance in English of what will eventually become just doppelganger, taking it back to its German roots. Now, why has the doppelganger been so requested on this show? Well, a few times anyway. I'm not quite sure, except that others have noticed or have heard my mentioning that I have my own doppelganger issues. I am pretty sure I mentioned it on this podcast before, or perhaps on other podcasts I've been on, at some live talks about it, live talks as well when asked about it. That in my newest book, a collection of short stories called Oh Monstrous World, my excellent publisher at Press 53, at one point in the publication process brought up the fact that my book has a lot of doppelganger stories, and I immediately thought, no, it doesn't. It doesn't have. Has one, and then he started listing out the various stories that are either about doppelgangers, or they have doppelgangers in them, or they have doppelgangerish themes, and one after another, I thought, oh my god, he's right. I have doppelganger issues, and I'm not really sure why. So what does it mean? I don't know. I had one of the world's best living scholars on this show not too long ago, Dr. Tom Shippey, and I asked him, hoping he would point me to some direction that would sort me out. He went immediately to an excellent example, that of Ursula K. Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea. That's the first book of her Earthsea fantasy series. It came out in, I'm pretty sure, late 60s, like 69 or so. It was this crazy concept of a young wizard who goes to wizardry school. Does that sound familiar? And if you're wondering, wait a minute, did Ursula K. Le Guin ever get mad about J.K. Rowling doing her Harry Potter series and finding much more success than Ursula K. Le Guin ever found? Yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin was a little miffed about that, but then looked past, she wrote an excellent essay about it, and she looked past that kind of pettiness to realize that what's at the heart of fantasy and the need for more critics to be aware of fantasy. One such critic who is brilliant and aware of it is Dr. Tom Shippey. And he kind of clarified his answer by that example, I think. So in The Wizard of Earthsea, the main character, whom we know as Ged, G-E-D, and now every time I see GED testing, I can only think of Ged, testing Ged, which he goes through some tests and does horrible things that tear the fabric of the world. And one of those things is he releases some kind of shadow beast from the netherworld or the other world. No one really knows, and it's a thing so dangerous that not even the wisest and most powerful wizards or dragons in Earthsea really know what he is to do about it. And this thing can't be fought, can't be stopped, can't be held back. And the shadow thing just keeps coming after him. And everybody knows it will inevitably finish the job it started in trying to completely destroy him. He runs from it for most of his life. And he ends up realizing that he must turn the tables and start bringing the fight to this shadow of his that he's released. A big part of the way magic works, the magic system in the story world of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea, is that everything has its true name, which might not necessarily be that different from our world, just by the by. But everything has its true name, and if you know its true name, then you can exert your will over it, and you can change things, and that's essentially magic. And the problem with this shadow creature is that as brilliant or as powerful as Ged becomes, he can't figure out what its true name is, and if he can't do that, he can't work any magic against it. it, but it knows his name and uses it against him. And so there are a series of these battles between Ged and his shadow, and then it becomes a strangely unique chase scene in the latter part of the book. And he finally encounters and corners this shadow at the very ends of the earth in this null space, and he confronts it, and at that moment you realize, he's finally figured out the name of the shadow, which is, of course, if you're paying close attention to the summary, his own name. This shadow is himself, or this aspect of himself that got severed from him in his ambitions, and now he has decided to tackle and embrace and essentially ingest this shadow enemy that he's been fighting his whole life. And then once he does, his life's not perfect, right? He's living with this monster inside of him, but now rather than running from it or trying to chase it down or trying to figure out its mystery, now it's a part of him and he's accepted and learned it, and so he has control over it. And so he ends the book whole, or has found himself in a way. It just happens to be extremely literal in this case, in part because it's fantasy, so the powerful abstract ideas are concretized, in part because she said it was a young adult or a children's book, although like most really good ones, it holds up perfectly well for full-grown and intelligent adults. And so I think that story kind of gets at maybe the heart of what a doppelganger is, at least in some direction. And it's a quite literal example of what Carl Jung was trying to get at with his concept of this shadow, which is every kind of bad person or bad thing that you would apply to other human beings out there in the world is a part of you. You could at any point be those evil things, and in many ways you have your own evil inside of you. If you hate Nazis and you hate Hitler, you haven't yet thought all the way through that your own shadow is a Nazi or a Hitler. If you hate commies, or you hate serial killers, or you hate people who cut you off in traffic, don't be too blind to the fact that deep down inside, you are those same things. And the doppelganger is, perhaps among other things, this chance to see that other you, or maybe that other version of you that you could be, or that evil version of you, or the dark side of you split off. And so that's all the more apparent as a separate being outside of you. Because, well, in Carl Jung's mind, if you don't incorporate that shadow like Ged did literally, if you don't face and then ingest that evil side of yourself so that you could have it under control, then what happens is it gets away from you and it will chase you down, and there's no defeating it once you externalize it. And I think we have no shortage of examples throughout the centuries upon centuries of human beings externalizing the kind of evil that really eats them up inside, and instead pick out somebody else, pretend to be victimized by that somebody else, and then find ways to attack them, whether it's directly or physically, or trying to use proxies to try to attack that something else that really is some version of their own evil that they haven't actually confronted in and of themselves. I think one reason why those people who spend some time disciplining their own dangerous nature end up being a little bit more rounded and better able to handle the stresses of the world, I think. I think that's the kind of discipline that one might see in perhaps a really experienced martial artist, in the way that they can handle all sorts of problems just with a slight bit more stability than non-martial artists, even those things that have nothing to do with martial arts, because perhaps they've confronted and tamed that dangerous side. Well, who knows? Maybe I'm getting down to the meaning of of what doppelgangers are right here. So let's maybe let's jump to a different example out of literature, one that will mess up all the answers that I just tried to give and probably contradict all of them. I'm thinking of Poe. I'm thinking of Edgar Allan Poe because he has doppelganger kinds of themes that keep popping up. Doppelganger themes, say in the Cask of Amontillado or the Telltale Heart, in which they're not exactly doppelgangers, but there's something about the object of hate that the protagonist has that is so close to the protagonist himself. And in the Cask, you have like this main character who hates this other one, who's also this expert wine, or this wine expert. And so he wants to take him down to the cellars of the city and brick him away so he never has to confront this other better version of himself. Even in the Telltale Heart, when the main character is spending hours upon hours observing the old man he plans on murdering, when he sees the old man's reactions to this little noises that he gives off, this old man's terror in bed, he ends up saying something to the effect of, I know exactly what he's going through. I go through the terror that he's feeling right now. I go through that all the time. And these little phrases keep popping up throughout the story of his identifying himself with exactly what the old man is going through, until the point where the cops finally show up to the house after he has murdered the old man, and they say, we are here because of a reported scream. What was it? And he says, oh, it was mine own in a dream. Well, once again, he's trying to associate, or whether he knows it or not, he's essentially saying that I am the old man that I murdered. And by the end of the story, we never get any type of direct evidence to show us that the old man ever even existed in the first place. From the very first paragraph, we know that our main character is capable of hallucination, and he's got his issues on top of that. And by the end, the cops never confirm that there was ever an old man. All we really know is that there's something that he thinks he has killed, and he has identified himself with it over and over again. So by the end of the story, was there ever even an old man? Or is this some kind of strange psychological doppelganger story? Something Poe would be quite capable of doing, I think. But maybe I should throw and there are like clearer examples of doppelgangers in Edgar Allan Poe, but maybe one that would throw things off a little bit would be to consider the fall of the House of Usher. In that story, and I've talked about it before on a Gothics episode at least, if not in other episodes, it's just a beautiful little gem of a story. I think one that's often overlooked or maybe underthought about, understudied, in that you've got a story in which this main character is coming back to the House of Usher to visit his old friend, Roderick Usher. And so the house itself is a return. The Usher himself is constantly compared to the earlier version of himself. And so the house is a bit of a different version of itself, a doppelganger. Usher himself is a doppelganger. There's a brother and sister pair, and this pairing and this mirroring keeps showing up. Even at the very beginning, when the visitor comes to the House of Usher, we have this beautiful, strange moment in which the house is so disturbing overall for him to look at. Something about the atmosphere and the angles and the nearly personality of the house disturbs him so much he looks away and ends up focusing on what is kind of like a moat, like this lake that envelops the grounds of the house, and in those waters he sees that house reflected. And we have a long moment of we're considering the house as in just one of two houses, a house standing on the house, in the dark mirror version of the house right underneath it. And that comes back in the story as well. And so you've got this mirroring going on in what is essentially a pure Gothic. And it didn't really occur to me that the Gothic story really involves doppelgangers and mirrors and these doublings until recently. I read one of Shirley Jackson's stories I should have read years, if not decades ago, but it was new to me. It was called The Lovely House. I think I encountered it in Joyce Carol Oates' excellent Gothics anthology. And in this story, The Lovely House, man, talk about one of the most disturbing Gothic short stories you could possibly find. I think they're just as disturbing or fascinating Gothic novels, Shirley Jackson being at the top of that list as well. But she does it just as well in this short story, The Lovely House. Man, that thing will bend your mind. Try reading Lovely House and then just sitting with it and without answers. By the end of that story, as you're piecing this thing together, although you might not know exactly what was supposed to have happened in this world, what you end up having done is experienced this Gothic in which you have characters who are encountering what are essentially other versions of themselves throughout time, so much so that you're wondering, wait, is our main character just a ghost in this kind of purgatory stuck in this house? Something about the story itself, like the House of Usher, is a return. Everybody's coming back to this thing, even though it's completely new. So it is simultaneously the return to something new that you've already encountered before. And there's no clear way to explain what that even is except by images in these stories. You have characters who, by the end of the story, were never really there, and yet they were always there in a different form. And so at any given point, you have a character who was another character, even though they're quite different. And you've got mirrorings of the main character seeing her own portrait in an ancient mosaic on the floor. You've got images of the house itself being mirrored in the needlework of the people who live in it, recreating pictures of the house that they live in. You've got the just like in the House of Usher, this deeply interesting scene of the house mirrored in the lake that surrounds the house. And so you have the dark mirror water house right under the real house. It's a strange series of mirrors of people and of the house itself. And then as that's hitting me, and as I'm having to deal with this challenging and disturbingly fascinating story, it's hitting me that, man, many of the great Gothics have this doppelganger in them, or this doubling. You can think of, for instance, ever so quickly, the turn of the screw. You have the governess who's there to replace the old governess, the past housekeeper that brought trouble. There were actually two of them. The kids, there are two of them. There's this constant concern about whether the face you just saw outside of the window was the dead returned, or was it your own reflection? So there's all this mirroring in there. In Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, there's this doubling of thinking about going back to Manderley, and then you go to Manderley, and then you have the new wife replacing the old wife, and there's this strange doubling there. It's even clearer, I think, in the Castle of Otranto, the very first Gothic by Horace Walpole. In the Castle of Otranto, you have what is essentially this father who wants to replace his son as the groom for what was going to be his daughter-in-law, and so he's pursuing her, Isabella, at all costs to marry her and continue his family line. That's at least seems to be his excuse for going after her. Of course, he already has a wife, and so it becomes this strange kind of gothic soap opera of trying to divorce his wife while trying to capture his new wife. And then the young ladies continue to be young ladies. He also has a daughter, and the story and the young ladies continue to be saved by this mysterious young man who ends up being not only the striking image of the original ancestor who owned Otranto, the great hero Alfonso, but in many ways is clarified by the supernatural signs or messages that keep happening through this story. This ghost giant in the castle or bleeding statues. It keeps being clarified that this new mysterious young man, although he is his own individual and of royal lineage himself, is like the reincarnation of Alfonso, and pictures of the old ancestor are disturbingly accurate to his own image, and people keep confusing him with somebody else. So all of that's doubling and doppelganger motif happening in that, and there are more of it in that story as well. And by the end of the book, everybody keeps being related to it. It's kind of like Return of the Jedi, right? Everybody just ends up being a Muppet or related. It gets really melodramatic and weird. But if you're in the right mood, it's a great read. Yet this image in the Gothic of these doubles, these doppelgangers keep showing up. I don't know what that means, and I don't really know why it's part of the house other than the house of the Gothic. Other than, I don't know what that means. Maybe you do. Shoot some messages to me. Maybe I'll pause and slide off to another couple examples and come back to figure out if the Wizard of Earthsea doppelganger, what that meant. I think that was a clearer path toward meaning, but what in the world the doubling in the Gothic means, I'm not quite sure. Well, how about this then? How about let's get older and older. Let's go into Ovid's Metamorphoses, when he takes that moment to tell the old Greek myth, Ovid, Roman, in Latin, writing in Latin, of course, but to retell this old myth of Narcissus and Echo. Man, that's early on doppelgangers. And in that story, you have this nymph, Echo, who makes Hera mad, or Juno, everybody makes Juno / Hera mad, don't they? And so Echo ends up being punished by her loquaciousness by having her voice turn to nothing but an echo. And so that's where we get our word echo, supposedly. Anyway, we have this nymph who is cursed to only be able to re-speak what others have spoken. And after she falls into this curse, she spies this beautiful young man who ends up being named Narcissus, and he's on a quest for love, and she falls in love with him, tries to speak with him, and there are these weird moments where he says something and she says it back, and it's as if she doesn't quite get that what she is hearing out of her own voice is the echo itself, and so she gets the wrong idea and she falls madly in love with him, and he wants nothing to do with her. She kind of fades away out of absolute grief, and her flesh withers away, and she's left only as a skeleton and still echoing, and her bones turn to stone, and so she's this weird stone skeleton wandering the woods. Now I realize Ovid probably probably meant me to think that her bones become stone, and so she is just rocks. You see rocks out in the woods. But that's not what I was left with. I was left with a stone skeleton of a nymph wandering the woods, echoing everything you say. That's terrifying to me, by the way. But the Narcissus side of this thing, the echo is like audio doppelganger, right? But the Narcissus story is and most people know it, right? He sees his reflection. He finds himself so beautiful that he's in love with his own reflection. He stares at it and doesn't eat or drink, and then dies and becomes a flower. The end, right? But for Ovid, Ovid takes that a whole lot deeper in a more disturbing way. He takes it to the point of Narcissus realizing that this person he has fallen madly in love with is just his own reflection. And yet his love is no less real for his realization of that. He burns with passion to embrace this person that he is cursed to never be able to embrace. As he says something to the effect of how tragic it is that the barrier between them is so thin as to be only this reflection. He sees this person he's in love with on the other side of the water, and yet he can never embrace that person. He can never truly kiss that person. In fact, he can't even pursue and be denied, because he is the pursued as well as the pursuer, and so both are pursuing. He can't even speak. He can't even have as much relationship as he did with Echo, who will speak back to him. Is that there is no speaking back. It is only himself, and he bears so much pain in realizing this. He's like, I wish for death. I want to die rather than spend another day having the person I love, and that person loving me so much, and yet we are cursed by this evil, strange world to constantly be separated, and yet haunted and tempted by this image that we can never cross over and finally be together. And so out of that, he cuts himself off from food and eventually dies out there in the wilderness. And the other nymphs want to raise this memorial funeral for him, and find that he has been turned into the flower that overlooks the waters itself. That's a much more fascinating approach to this, not only the Narcissus story, but I think the Doppelganger, and you get other writers in the vein of Borges, writers like Paulo Coelho, who try out these little parables in which they reimagine the Narcissus story. I think in The Alchemist, Paulo Coelho starts off with something like telling the Narcissus story from the pawn's perspective, as in, once Narcissus was dead and gone, the waters itself missed him. But that's actually not a retelling of Ovid's version of it. If you take Ovid's version of it as seriously, the reflection of Narcissus loves him just as much as Narcissus loved the reflection. They were just cursed to be constantly separated. That's a fascinating and perhaps a lovelier, but still just as sorrowful version of this Doppelganger story. Man, what other kinds of examples? Oh, well, I brought up Borges. Man, Borges, he was absolutely fascinated with this concept of mirrors and doubles. I think perhaps it was clearest, well, not clearest, but it was quite clear in a story that the great late Harold Bloom said was his favorite Borges story, Death and the Compass, in which you have this this rational, logical investigator, kind of like Auguste Dupin from Edgar Allan Poe. And his name is Lonrot, and that was like something like Maple Red or Red Maple or something, that name. And he's after this crime lord, this mobster crime lord, and chasing him through, I guess it's Buenos Aires. And this crime lord of this Jewish mafia, his name is Red Scarlock the Dandy. And that's not an awesome name. And yet, Red Scarlock the Dandy and Red Maple the Investigator are seen over and over again as these kinds of doubles. And of course, Red Scarlock's murders and clues he's leaving behind are just a series of traps in this elaborate labyrinth to finally get his arch rival, the investigator. And the investigator is walking into these traps, knowing them to be the labyrinth they are, to get to his arch rival, the criminal, the murderer mob lord. And the trap finally comes together at the end, and in the end everything is doubled. Everything about the room is doubled. Everything about the event is doubled. Everything about the place it's set. Like, there's just a series of double images everywhere. And at the end, when Lonrot faces his ultimate death, he's like, well, your labyrinth and your traps that you used to get me, the only problem is that they're not aesthetically elegant as they could be. There were some unnecessary duplications. And when I return in a future life, and you return as well, and we go through this yet again, and you murder me yet again, I request that you make it more elegant this time. And Red Scarlock the Dandy is like, yes, when we shall return, I shall make the most elegant labyrinth, which is the single line that has no width or breadth, the one that continues indefinitely. And so you have this image of this final long string, which is a labyrinth in itself, which is kind of related to the labyrinth that scared Borges the most, which was a mirror facing a mirror. And I know you've done this before, where you have one mirror to another and it creates this infinite labyrinth of this single line of doubles and doubles and doubles and doubles that stretch on for infinity. And so it's not a double at that point, it's just infinite reduplication of this image. And that's always scared me, perhaps not as much as it has scared Borges, but there's something quite fascinating and strange about that. There are other examples I wanted to get to. I feel like I really want to talk about Jekyll and Hyde as being perhaps one of the most, is it the most powerful doppelganger tale? Because you could say that. All right, here's my problem with Jekyll and Hyde. It's fantastic. I've got a lot to say about it. And I was on the fence about that being a doppelganger story or not, because rather than another image of the self, a big part of the theme is that the evil one, Mr. Hyde, is so much different from the good one, Dr. Jekyll, that even though it's the same person, it's the difference in the personalities that are fascinating. But then you could take it back to like Ged and his shadow, as Mr. Hyde is his dark version of himself. So it is. I'm all right. I've talked myself into it. Jekyll and Hyde is the great doppelganger story. I didn't even get to like Fight Club with Tyler Durden as the doppelganger of the protagonist, or even Lovecraft's The Outsider. Man, that's a perfect doppelganger story. Check out H.P. Lovecraft's short story, The Outsider. Check out Chuck Palahniuk's novel, The Fight Club. The movie's good too. Check out those if you're thinking about doppelgangers. I'm getting up on 40 minutes and I haven't even really dug into Jekyll and Hyde, so maybe I'll let those sit aside, along with the cheesier ones like The Great Doppelganger Battle and Army of Darkness, among other things. Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Man, oh man, maybe that deserves its own episode. Maybe that's what I should do with it, because I think that's one of the great classic monsters of that era that never really got its due as being a part of our culture of iconic monsters. We have the iconic Dracula, we have the iconic Frankenstein, we even have the iconic, say, Mummy. Invisible Man works its way in there, in large part because of the Universal Studios films. But we also have iconic witches and these kinds of things. We should have had the iconic Jekyll and Hyde. But we know of it, but we don't, and we should have. And it's too bad that that era has kind of passed. Because Jekyll and Hyde not only was so fascinating and actually quite a scary and disturbing read, even to modern readers. The moment where Mr. Hyde is trudging down the dark streets of London, and there's this poor little urchin girl who just happens to be in his way, and he stomps coldlessly across her body, and his boot heels are like smashing into her poor little flesh and bones while she's screaming in bloody murder to the top of her lungs under his feet, and he continues walking as if he had never encountered anything. And it wasn't that he wasn't aware, he just didn't care so much that he trampled this poor little girl nearly to death. Later on, he does full-on killing. It's a disturbing scene, man. God. And so it's a fantastic novel, and in many ways, it kind of set the stage for what ended up being our modern concept of psychology, that there are other aspects to yourself, and then there are repressed or suppressed versions of your consciousness. And so you have the unconscious mind nested within the conscious, or vice versa. And I think Jekyll and Hyde essentially set the stage for Freud, who essentially created all modern psychology as we know it, even though some of his weirder mythology, elements of his mythology, have kind of been singled out as those are the contributions of Freud. But there was more to it. Essentially, most of what we know as modern psychology came out of Freud, which, although we could say he got his start from Hamlet, even though he says it's more of an Oedipus Greek myth story, I think it's quite clear that he was haunted by Shakespeare's Hamlet. But really, this stage was set more directly with Jekyll and Hyde. And I think that set the stage not only for Freud, who knew it well, but I think the wider society was more ready to accept what Freud had brought along, because we all really started figuring it out in Jekyll and Hyde, as seeing that you think you're one way, and you want to try to be a better and better person, but as you try to split off this dark side, because essentially Jekyll was trying to make himself even better, take those bad parts of himself and essentially dissolve them. All he did was split it off and try to separate himself rather than incorporating his dark, evil, or dangerous side. He tried to exclude it, and as we learn from not only the Doppelganger monster, but all monsters, if you don't face, confront, or integrate the monster in yourself, what it's going to do is rise up, and it's going to get you and take over and destroy your world. And essentially that's what Mr. Hyde becomes. He sets loose his dark side doppelganger. And so in that way, it's a lot like Ged and his shadow, that you have the monster inside you, and you have the choices of accepting that or denying that. And if you accept it, then you have to go through the extremely scary and painful and, demanding process of disciplining yourself while incorporating that dark side. And if you deny it, you can try running or fighting or seeing it elsewhere in external sources. But sooner or later, that monster is going to win that fight. So maybe we should call it there. Maybe we should call that at least one solid attempt at tackling the doppelganger. I went into this talk about 40-something minutes ago, 44 minutes ago, really not knowing what in the world a doppelganger meant. And I still don't know now, but I hope you have some ideas, or at least I hope I've spurred you into some thoughts or pointed you to some directions of some excellent doppelganger stories. So if you made it this far, you survived another episode of The Monster Professor. If you've got some comments, questions, requests for me, if you know some people who would be excellent guests, you name it, anything on your mind, shoot me a message. Check out my website, joshwoodsauthor.com. And see you next time.